Welcome back to the Big Sky Business Insights Summit. I'm Grant Keir, President and CEO of the Missoula Economic Partnership. We just finished a great conversation with our panelists, far-ranging about some of the innovations that have taken place in Montana, in some of our systems, in terms of state government and approval processes, and also sort of what's still needed. We're about to have a great in-depth conversation with Dr. Blake Wiedenheft and Avery Sonnenberg, which I hope will share some insights into what it takes to attract innovators to Montana to be a part of this process and how we can continue to foster innovation and a culture of innovation in our state. So I'd like to welcome Avery and Blake back onto the screen. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to them. We'll look forward to a great, rich conversation. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Grant. All right, that was a great conversation that we just had with our panelists. Now, Blake and I are going to have a little chat about some of the things that we're passionate about and how that leads into maybe ways to seize this opportunity, because the COVID pandemic is really, in a lot of ways, a seismic shift in global civilization. So how do we seize that in a way that accelerates Montana's desire to be sort of a biotechnology, biosciences hub and support what we already have here. So I think we'll start off, Blake, if you don't mind. We're going to nerd out a little bit on virology and bacteriology, and I promise everyone watching that this leads somewhere that makes sense. We talked at the end of the panel discussion about how there's a renewed interest by students in biosciences, in learning about virology and bacteriology. And my suspicion is that a lot of that is people want to learn, what are these viruses? How do they work? How do they infect people? How do we prevent them from infecting people? How do we make vaccines to them? And that, to me, is sort of the original study of these microorganisms, microbiology, virology, and bacteriology. What I think maybe a lot of people don't realize is that modern diagnostics and genomics is based on the discoveries learned from that fundamental science at an academic level have been sort of hijacked to do our bidding in a way that allows us to do diagnostics. And then even beyond that, we'll talk a little bit about CRISPR and how these again, molecular machinery from these organisms has been hijacked to not just do our bidding on the diagnostics front, but to move on to gene editing. So with that, Blake, maybe talk a little bit about your experience studying microorganisms and why would you want to look at microorganisms from boiling hot acid pools in Yellowstone?
Yeah, well, let me start, Avery, by saying thanks for doing this panel and the last one as well, and also to Grant and the rest of the people at the Missoula Economic Partnership. It's a great forum, and I feel lucky to be part of it. I'll start with your first question about the role of universities and the interest in molecular biology. And I think, like I was saying before, there's a renewed interest in virology for obvious reasons. And I think one of the benefits that we as instructors now have is that it's no longer kind of obscure why we care, but now everybody has a real, more tangible interest in virology in general. And so it doesn't feel like something so maybe academic that we're trying to teach them, but something that's really relevant in their everyday lives now. So I think it makes the teaching task much easier. Why would I want to study microbiology in the hot springs of Yellowstone National Park? And in the process of this, I hope I can tell you a story that's a little bit ironic about how that early work in Yellowstone National Park is related to the current pandemic. So my interest in studying life in high temperature environments was just one born out of just pure curiosity. I met some inspiring individuals here at MSU as a graduate student that were excited about science and infinitely curious about all things life, but in particular about how things thrive in boiling acid. And Yellowstone was a perfect place to study that. So my job as a graduate student was to cruise around Yellowstone National Park, one of the most beautiful places in the world, and collect samples from these high temperature environments. I just described how I was using a paint stick with a coffee cup at the end to capture wastewater coming through a tube down at the reclamation facility. But as a graduate student, I was doing some of those same things, but just capturing not wastewater, but rather standing a safe distance away from an erupting geyser to try to capture some of the sample that I could then bring back to the lab here at MSU. And we had created some artificial hot springs here. My advisors at the time were Mark Young and Trevor Douglas. And these are the inspiring mentors that really shaped my career and gave me a lot of freedom to just say, yeah, go to Yellowstone, bring those samples back and see what you can grow. And in the course of doing that, we had an emphasis or a real interest in the viruses that were there. And as I think I've told you before, but maybe it's worth mentioning again, gazing through the lens of an electron microscope to see a virus that nobody else had ever laid eyes on was pretty transformative. And I think that's something that has stuck with me, or kind of was changed my life and how I view life on this planet. It's worth pointing out that since organisms that come from those habitats have to replicate and survive in boiling temperatures, that a lot of the enzymes that they use for everyday aspects of their lives can then be repurposed in creative ways to do things that nature never intended. And one of those things is in an enzyme called Taq polymerase that came from Mushroom Springs in Yellowstone National Park that is now used to perform the PCR assays that everybody is talking about. I think it's almost become a common part of everybody's vernacular. PCR stands for polymerase chain reaction. And it's this sort of molecular photocopy machine that makes more copies of a specific nucleic acid. And when you copy the viral nucleic acid, it gives off light. So the more light you get, the more virus you have. And so that's kind of how the technique is used to measure and quantify the amount of virus that's in a given sample, whether that's in wastewater, whether it's in the nasal swab of a patient, or whether it's a virus that happens to be in Yellowstone, not SARS-CoV-2, obviously, but the viruses that infect organisms that live there. I guess my own transition, if I'm not talking too much, is that in studying the microorganisms that live in the hot springs in Yellowstone, I was increasingly interested in not just the viruses themselves, but how those so-called primitive microorganisms were responding to this insidious and pervasive infection and predation by viruses in those habitats. If every time I bring a sample back from Yellowstone and look at it through the electron microscope, I see viruses, then it must mean that those hosts are under constant threat of viral infection. And in fact, they are, and they've evolved a myriad of different immune systems to ward off or protect themselves from those viral infections. One of which is kind of timely to discuss, I suppose, is called Crisprs. It's an adaptive immune system that's found in microbes that live in your gut, but also in the habitats of Yellowstone and just about everywhere else. It's an adaptive immune system that's recently been repurposed for targeted genome engineering. And this morning, there was an exciting announcement that Emmanuelle Charpentier and Jennifer Doudna were co-awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for their contributions in understanding how this immune system in bacteria could be repurposed to do targeted genome engineering in a way that's curing genetic diseases. So the other thing that I think is important to point out there in terms of a business and economic summit like the one that we're having today is that those innovations that are coming out of the university, those are really kind of hearkening back to the metaphor that Bryce Ward introduced on the first day. The university is really the cultivation bed for these new ideas. And as I said to you earlier, the discovery of genome engineering wasn't a bunch of scientists going looking for a new set of scissors that could be used for genome engineering. It was scientists that were just curious about something that was so fundamental. How do bacteria survive in the face of constant predation? There's 10 to the 23 infections of bacteria on this planet every second. It's a number that's almost unfathomable. But under such heavy selective pressures from viral predators, those organisms must have evolved incredibly sophisticated ways to fight off viral infections. And that was just a basic research question that we were interested in understanding. How did bacteria, avoid infections or dying by infection? And then through serendipity, through discovery, through creative repurposing, it was understood how you could take some bacteria, kind of crack them open, spill out the guts, and take these machines that are inside those bacteria and reprogram them to do something that nature never intended. And that is to cut out defective pieces of DNA and repair it in a way that's curing genetic diseases, most recently sickle cell and beta thalassemia.
Yeah, it's incredible. And I got into diagnostics originally from electrical engineering. So my exposure to these things is from the get-go as a tool. I wasn't studying them, but I got more into it. How do these work? Why would I want to use one enzyme versus a different enzyme? What do you mean it came from a 98-degree, steam vent under the ocean or something like that?
Yeah, there's another feature of immune systems is they get really diverse. So from a tools perspective, from a perspective of the people that are really now they understand the value of Crispr. That's something that's been celebrated even before the announcement of the Nobel Prize, right? It's a discovery that's valued at somewhere around $40 billion. Serendipitous discovery that led to some creative new application. But the versatility of these enzymes is pretty limitless, and the applications are really restricted to our own creativity. So now, as I'm sure you're aware, but maybe others aren't, CRISPRs have been repurposed beyond just genome engineering to cut out defective pieces of DNA, but rather now they're being used also as molecular diagnostics, and they're at the front lines of the COVID pandemic, something none of us would have ever guessed a decade ago.
So maybe that's a good time to segue into your transition back to Montana. So you're, obviously involved in this world-class scientific project, now recognized as both having a huge impact on human health, a huge economic impact, as well as being a huge contribution, scientifically. You're the perfect example to me of how we can attract, world-class, brilliant talent back to Montana. So could you talk a little bit about what helped you make that decision to come to Montana to start your research lab, the support you received, the support maybe you wish you had received if you didn't get what you needed, and how we can help other people make that decision that Montana is a place to build and grow their bioscience careers.
Sure. That's really generous of you to say. I think for me, it was a bit of a natural transition. I explained how my research here at MSU as a graduate student prepared me for the work that I did at Berkeley. When I visited Jennifer's lab for an interview in 2007 as a postdoc, I was coming into a lab that had studied RNAi and used a lot of structural biology tools. That kind of thing is exposure that I had. I had exposure to those techniques and some of those ideas here at MSU, but I was really bringing my expertise in understanding the conflict between bacteria and viruses. And when I visited Jennifer's lab in 2007, I recall that we just kind of strolled around campus together and were brainstorming how our different interests might overlap. And CRISPR seemed like it was something that was brand new. The implications weren't known at all. And we were just kind of scribbling down on paper and greaseboard, what experiments could we do that would help us understand how these things work mechanistically, with not the expectation at the time that was going to lead to a new genome engineering tool, but just really out of curiosity. And then, of course, by the time I left Jennifer's lab 5 years later to start my own research program, I entered a lab where nobody studied CRISPRs, and I left a lab where everybody studied CRISPRs. And it was an exciting and sometimes stressful atmosphere to be part of, but it was incredibly important to me in terms of professional development. So in terms of, what was important in my own course may not be important for everybody's course, but for me, it was important to leave and then come back in a way that I was a different person than I was when I left here to begin with. When I came back, I was completely supportive. MSU has been extremely supportive in my research program. And I think, there are some unique challenges here that maybe some of my colleagues who picked one of the schools on the East or West Coast. But I think the reason that I'm here is not different than the reason that you're here, Avery, or maybe just about anybody else that's been part of the summit. We're here because it's a place where we can do the things we love, both professionally, but outside of our professional lives. And it's really a lifestyle draw that drew me back to Montana. And I feel pretty lucky to not only be able to live and work in Montana, but then also to pass it forward a little bit. So I was a young undergraduate coming from the middle of nowhere. I grew up in Fort Peck. I've told you this story before. It's a town of 300 people with 2 stop signs. So at times in places in Montana, I was called a city kid. And I came to Bozeman and had this, academic awakening. And now I get to participate in that from the other side of the desk. I get to see students that are coming to MSU that are smarter than they know and alert them to a future in biosciences that they are oftentimes completely unaware of, that can really be a future for them. Not just something that they study, but actually a career path.
So then what can we do to support them either directly after they leave the university in terms of providing and supporting entrepreneurship and jobs, or even let them know that if they leave and go get some experience somewhere else, we can, try to find a way for them to come back?
Yeah, that's a great question. One I wish I was more qualified to answer, but I think that things are starting to change, and it's a part of the theme of this discussion is that it's really about a much larger ecosystem. So I think when people know that there's jobs for them here in those kinds of fields, and maybe the COVID pandemic has really highlighted the importance of that skill set and brings them back to pursue careers here in one of these emerging companies that's starting, or in academia, or whatever capacity that might look like. But I think one of the things that's been a bit of a challenge for Montana has been the critical mass, to know that there's enough bioscience here, to know that there's enough of an educational system, a university system to serve as that feeder where those ideas that have real economic potential but weren't pursued because they had economic potential, started at a university and then spun out and gave opportunities to these students that were training in some of those same laboratories to take it and run, to take it to the next level, and to make a meaningful product out of that.
Yeah, and speaking from the Two Bear Capital side, I think we're absolutely the beneficiaries of that, of the ecosystem that is there. It seems like it's not maybe quite at that critical mass, but it's getting there. And I think the people in that community have been able to use sort of the closeness of the community rather than the smallness of the community to their advantage. In that, I think once you get to a certain size critical mass, you worry more about competition, whereas I think we're still in the collaboration trumps all kind of phase.
Yeah, it's certainly a two-way street. And I think, we've been in a little bit of the chicken and the egg problem for quite some time. There's going to be no capital that comes in without enough infrastructure to support, the investments from venture capitalists or other kinds of capital. But of course, we need that in order to build that infrastructure and to build the critical mass. So one has to come before the other, and it's been a little bit of a slow rise, but I feel like, we've left the lag phase and we're in exponential phase now, where people like Mike Gogan and Two Bear Capital have the resources and the vision to recruit people like you and the rest of his team to come here and to try to find that entrepreneurial spirit that Montana is known for, and to foster that in a way that does put us on the map.
Yeah, I definitely think comparing what I've seen in entrepreneurs in Montana versus some of the companies that we interact with outside of Montana, there's definitely a hardworking scrappiness and sort of creative problem-solving attitude that is not always present everywhere, right? So we're definitely the beneficiaries, having invested in a number of Montana companies of that spirit.
Well, let's be honest. I mean, if you're in Montana and you're not scrappy, you're not going to make it. So
That's right.
The selective pressure that is what makes this Montana special.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, we interact very heavily with folks that are in Montech. So that's been a great resource, that sort of transition from U of M to this ModTech startup space. So we have both fire diagnostics and Inimmune are sort of on the front lines of different aspects of fighting this pandemic. And those are both companies that we're incredibly excited about that we would have probably invested in no matter where they were. They just happen to be in Montana, which is
two
amazing
incredible
to me.
examples. And I think that, you're benefiting, but so are they from the investments, but also from the space. I think one of the things that's been missing from Montana that has limited entrepreneurialism in biotech sector has been the space in order to do life sciences and to bring to spin out ideas out of the university into companies. But I think that demand is being met. And I think that Montech is a perfect example. And the fact that they're full means that we have more capacity building to do. And I think the enterprise that Mike Goguen and Two Bear have kind of built up in the Flathead about building more biotech space, that's, it's really good news for people like me.
Yeah, and there's a third company in Montech too, Expecicor, that's working on therapeutics for neurodegenerative disease, which is a huge unmet need right now. But it's not necessarily as talked about as some of these other pandemic things. But you did bring up our plan to have an incubator space up in the Flathead Valley, and that's been kind of part of Mike Goggen's long-term plan for a very long time. So that's something that we are going to make happen. It's going to be incubator space, both for companies that, Two Bear Capital doesn't invest in, as well as companies that they do invest in. So as part of that plan, we also need to ensure that there's a pipeline of, incoming students that become qualified graduates that want to, live and work in Montana. So, being part of that ecosystem is very much part of my job description and my mandate. At least I hope so, because that's what I like doing. So we'll do anything, especially the part of Two Bear Capital that's in Montana. We'll do anything to further this ecosystem, because realistically we're direct beneficiaries of that. So
yeah, how do you think about that? I mean, one of the things I've been interested in is, it's great news that there's an incubator coming to Montana. The only downside to that is that, from my perspective, it's going to be in the Flathead Valley, and I would rather that it were in the Gallatin Valley so that it was more accessible to somebody like me. But of course, it's never going to be right in your backyard, and so it's going to be an unideal position for most people in a state like Montana, and the select few that are directly around that. So, how to facilitate the integration for people that go outside of your county, and make it seamless so that that different entrepreneurs can take advantage of that regardless of their geographic distribution?
That's a great question. And I think the geographic location is it is potentially going to be a stumbling block for some people, but as part of that system, I think it's important to foster community collaboration, where everybody can, work together to help locate talents and specific resources and expertise. So I think, hopefully as this ecosystem grows, we can harness some new modern communication tools in a way that lets us build that community and share what we learn.
I think that seems realistic. I mean, Montanans are good at turning lemons into lemonade, and I think one of the maybe silver linings of an otherwise tragic pandemic is we're becoming more and more comfortable with virtual platforms. Maybe this is one example of that. I'm still trying to get comfortable with the virtual platform myself, but nevertheless, I think it's breaking down some barriers of geography and facilitating collaborations, not just across county lines, but state lines and maybe countries as well.
I absolutely agree, and there's examples of people I know in the medical device industry, engineers that a year ago you would have said there's no way you can do your job remotely. You're an engineer that works on medical devices, but between the other people that are at different locations doing different experiments, and the way we sort of share resources already geographically, whether it's a sequencing machine or a rapid prototyping system or something like that, we kind of had to do it all remotely. So that sort of proved that we could. So maybe maybe it's not the case that we should always do it, but for a number of things, we can. So why not try? So with something like a biotech incubator that may have a number of shared research tools that are too expensive for one individual company or research lab to justify the capital expense, maybe that's something that could be done remotely with sending samples across the state. Another aspect that somebody had a question on here was the way that employers and entrepreneurs are engaging with education and training partners. We've actually at Two Bear had discussions with Flathead Valley Community College, with both the dean and the head of the biosciences department, Ruth Wrightsman, on what we can do to help both potentially bring guest lecturers there and help them with their sort of curriculum development in a way that prepares their students for laboratory positions in bioscience companies in Montana. So we're definitely interested in engaging with anyone else that wants to talk to us about what we see as the best ways to foster that partnership.
I think that's a good idea, and I think that a lot of universities are positioning themselves to do that. I mean, there was never such high demand for molecular biologists and people who knew which end of the pipette was the business end, but things have changed. COVID's been disruptive, if nothing else. And now there's a new interest and demand for people with those kinds of skills. And I think, it's up to the universities to be responsive to that kind of demand. But you can't be too capricious in your response, I suppose. I mean, it has to be clear that there's going to be a long-term demand and that this isn't a flash in the pan. Otherwise, you repurpose all this infrastructure and, you get this big ship moving in one direction, and then, tomorrow's demands change. But I don't think that life sciences and molecular biology, I don't think that that's an ephemeral need or demand. I think that that's something important for universities to recognize, and people like me to do a better job of preparing students to go out and fulfill the needs of these emerging companies.
And it's possible that the renewed interest will translate into additional research dollars that, pandemic or not, will translate into additional new jobs, new ideas, new companies, right?
Yeah, it might seem a little bit self-fulfilling, but I think the country that invests the most in research and heavily in academic research, that really is the breeding ground for new ideas that are going to spin out into transformative technologies, CRISPR just being the latest and greatest. But those kinds of things are happening all the time in research labs at universities around the globe. And I think that the United States has historically been the leader in that race, and things have changed a little bit, but I think we're still a dominant force in that space, and I hope we never lose that edge.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you and I both try to, tend to live in the scientific realm and predict what's going to change, what's going to happen there. Are there any other sort of societal seismic changes that Montana as a community can take advantage of or benefit from coming out the other side of this pandemic? Less happy living in urban areas with just the population density is one thing. So I think a number of communities in Montana have seen more people interested in working here, and maybe the proof that remote work is possible is also contributing to that trend.
Yeah, I think Jason Carter hit on that yesterday in a way that was humorous, but also poignant. He described the phases of the Montana economy, starting with the arrival of Brad Pitt with a fly fishing pole, and then went on to say that, one of the next phases is, or has been, or is currently the COVID pandemic, and doing just as you explained, people from either the east or the left coast are realizing that they're also interested in a quality of life that we have here. So I think the challenge for us is, how do we grow this ecosystem, quite literally and figuratively, in a way that preserves what we love about it, but also makes it accessible to those people who share that interest with us?
Yeah, absolutely.
Blake, Avery, was incredibly generous of you to share your thoughts and time with us today. It was really appreciate you being here. I really appreciate our opportunity to kind of listen in on your shared thinking. One of the themes that we've heard throughout the last 2 days is really the quality of people we have in Montana. And as a Montanan, I am grateful that you are both here. I think it's only a man who grows up on an eastern Montana ranch who shows up to be a guest speaker and then apologizes for speaking too much. So Blake, very much appreciate you speaking just the right amount to really give us some great insights. And Avery, thank you so much for outstanding job facilitating our conversations today. So
Thank you very much, Grant, for having me. I was very happy to be here. I enjoyed it very much.
Great.
Thanks, Grant. Thanks for all the work that you guys do at MEP.
Yeah, great. Take care. So for those of you in the audience, just really appreciate you joining us today. I heard some incredibly thoughtful conversation about acute needs that we have right now and things that we can be doing to accelerate anything from testing to indeed public communications about the kind of science that we are developing here in Montana. I think from my perspective, Blake just talked a little bit about whether or not there'd be future needs or this was a flash in the pan or where we were going with biosciences. And I certainly am not a bioscientist, but I'm trained in geology and geophysics. And one of the big issues of our time is climate change. And for many years, we saw the predictions that we were going to see increased frequency and intensity of fires. And of course, we see that now, and we saw the same notion about hurricanes, and we start to see that now. And one of the ancillary notions of climate change and certainly the population density of our planet is that we will see these things like pandemics starting to develop at perhaps increased frequencies. And I think part of our mission and goal of this summit is to think about ways that we encourage our communities, our state, and our country to bring our talent back home and to develop these skills here so that we are a resilient community and we have these talents at hand so that when we are facing something like COVID now and in the future, we are better prepared to address it and we have the tools we need to do it effectively. Which is a great segue to tomorrow's session. We're going to have an outstanding group of industry leaders and again, some other experts and some folks who have done some outstanding work for the state of Montana in economic development to take what we've heard these last 2 days and a couple of new case studies and really understand what can we do as a community. We're hoping to see a new bill coming out of Congress to find ways to invest in COVID relief and recovery. What can we do to advocate for the right kind of funding to really make a difference for what we need in Montana? What can we do at the state level? What do we need to change to really foster this industry, not just to address the acute needs that we have with COVID, but to really be resilient and robust and continue to grow in the years ahead? So we are grateful for you joining us today. We're looking forward to another great conversation starting tomorrow at 11 o'clock. It's been a wonderful experience to hear all of these great experts, and I'm sure we're going to get an even richer and continued excellent conversation tomorrow. Thanks for joining us for the Big Sky Insight Summit, and we will see you tomorrow.